Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Thank you for joining us this morning. It is really my pleasure to welcome you this morning to this important event on the institutional scaffolding that shapes and shoves the U.S. Mexico relationship, an extremely complicated relationship, both in breadth and depth. On the breadth side of the relationship, for example, both countries have to deal with a 2,000-mile border, one of the most intense trade and investment relationships in the world, repeated waves of crime and violence related to organized crime, which directly affect the millions of Mexicans and Americans daily, and of course, flows of guns and cash that feed the firepower of organized crime throughout. There's also regular and irregular migration flows, often complicated by the desirability of the U.S. labor markets, and of course, Mexico's strategic position as a gateway to the United States. It is also complicated by an overburdened infrastructure along the U.S.-Mexico border. The infrastructure has not really kept up pace with the intensity of the human flows and the trade relationship, of course. And there's also the need to share resources, natural resources like water. There are three major watersheds, the Tijuana River, the Colorado River, and the Rio Grande River, which also complicate, and we saw some of those issues play out last year when the quinquennial term and the time to bring the accounts, the exchanges of waters down to zero came around. There's also an increasing energy market integration, and recently, of course, compromised by Mexico's insistence on sovereignty as a framework for energy-related business. And a cultural and demographic integration like few in the world. 40 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans now live in the United States. This is quite a diaspora. And that, of course, is reflected in the remittances to Mexico, $41 billion in 2020, and I think 2021 is about to break a record again, maybe reaching $45 billion. And there's also, in addition to this, new challenges like climate change and rapid political and cultural changes within each society, transitions to different kinds of politics and different kinds of visions for both countries that often bleed into the political and the diplomatic relationship and impede progress on larger issues. And on the depth of the relationship, going vertically, we see that there is interaction at all levels. From the very highest levels, the high-level economic dialogue, the recently inaugurated high-level security dialogue, all the way down to conversations and agreements in the middle level bureaucracy, and all the way down to the local governments, state governments and local governments. So there's conversations happening all along with all kinds of memorandums and agreements, and some of them formal and informal, happening at all levels. So this is a very intense relationship, horizontally and vertically. It has great depth and great breadth. And so it's important to always keep our fingers on the pulse of this relationship. The beginning of the realization that most of the issues that affect both countries are really not international, but intermestic. They're a combination because we affect each other so intensely, is an inventory of what's out there. What's the institutional scaffolding that, again, shapes and shoves, to a large extent, the binational relationship. And for that, I think we have a great guest today, Guillermo Garcia Sanchez, a professor of law at Texas A&M University, who's been doing an inventory of all the formal agreements all the way up and down the relationship over the last few years. It's a very interesting project, so Guillermo will present some of his findings, and of course, there'll be some commentary on what that means. Many of these agreements are often signed, and not everybody knows exactly what they contain and how many there are. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of agreements, and so he'll talk to us about this project. And then to comment and bring this into a more interesting discussion about the formal and the informal components of it, where the rubber meets the road, what the relationship is like day to day, and what place these agreements play and of course, all the other informal arrangements and conversations that take place to place. We have two great guests today who know it firsthand. Ambassador Christopher Landau, who represented the United States in Mexico City, and Ambassador Jeronimo Gutierrez, who also represented Mexico in Washington, D.C. And for that, I think this is a privileged conversation, and it is an honor to receive our guests today. Over the next hour, we'll have a great conversation, and we'll begin by asking Guillermo to give us the framework, his research project and what it contains. And Guillermo, the microphone is yours, and welcome to the Baker Institute this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for that kind introduction and for setting the grounds for the conversation today. I'm just going to share very quickly the screen because I have a couple of slides that I want to share with the public about this particular research. So what motivated the research? So a couple of years ago, around 2016, with the Center for U.S. and Mexican Law, we organized a symposium where we brought regulators in the energy sector on both on the U.S. side and on the Mexican side to talk about regulating and developing joint resources in the Gulf of Mexico. One of the interesting things that came out of that conversation was that they mentioned the existence of MOUs. These are memorandums of understanding and letters of intent that many of the agencies had signed to coordinate and regulate together the development of those fields. So that was the first time that it piqued my attention, why these regulators and under what powers they were regulating that kind of approach to joint challenges. And then years later, in 2019, President Donald Trump threatened twice to close the border with Mexico. And then, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, Canciller Ebrard, flew to Washington, and they had a meeting, and then they came out with a joint statement of how they were going to be dealing with the migrant crisis at the border. And then a couple of days later, President Trump came out with a letter stating that he had a secret deal signed with Mexico, and this secret deal implied other type of duties that Mexico had committed to. And a Washington Post reporter took a snap picture of the agreement and was able to decode what the agreement said. And everybody, knows what the agreement contained. There was a whole conversation about Mexico, whether that was a remaining Mexico project or not. But what was missed in the conversation was the fact that this was another memorandum of understanding and a letter of intent that was going to be impacting the lives of, hundreds and thousands of Central Americans and Mexicans strained at the border. But again, it shows the example of that memorandums of understanding and letters of intent had a huge impact on the way they were facing common challenges. And then the final example that I had, and that also motivated part of this research, was the detention of General Cienfuegos. As you know, a couple of years ago, General Cienfuegos, who worked with the Peña Nieto administration, was detained in the United States under charges of working with the cartels. And Mexico complained with the United States, and one of the complaints one of the elements of the complaint included a memorandum of understanding that the DEA and the Mexican government had signed in the 1980s that was breached as part of the investigation over General Cienfuegos. So here are three examples of how memorandums of understanding, letters of intent have a huge impact on the way U.S.-Mexico relations operates. So I took the opportunity to ask and research how many of these agreements were out there and how are they regulated both on the U.S. side and the Mexican side. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal underpinnings of these agreements. I won't go into detail about it because this is more of a policy conversation, but it's important to understand the challenges of how these are defined on both sides. So on the Mexican side, the interinstitutional agreements, this type of agreements, the memorandums of understanding, letters of intent, signed by state authorities, but also local authorities. This means local governments, municipalities, federal agencies, state universities, anything that is state-oriented in Mexico can sign interinstitutional agreements with U.S. counterparts, or for that matter, with any other counterpart. On the U.S. side, these are called executive agreements. And these are basically agreements signed by the executive branch. It might be with an understanding that there was some legislative power that was given to the executive to engage in some sort of regulation. And I won't go into detail about that, but these are basically signed by executive agents. So again, under Mexico, these are actually regulated by public international law. So the Mexican legislation actually recognizes that they have a value when it comes to international law. And on the US side, there are basically considered most of them, especially the memorandums of understanding and letters of intent, ex ante congressional executive agreements. On the Mexican side, all of these agreements, doesn't matter where they're coming from, have to be registered in the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not have to keep a copy of the treaty or the agreement. They just have to register it. So they have a duty under the law to keep track of all these agreements. On the US side, unfortunately, it's a very incomplete list because under the CASE Act, only those agreements that contain concrete duties, international obligations of the United States have to be reported to Congress. And then they have to be disclosed through particular proceedings. But those that the State Department consider that do not contain specific obligations or specific duties, they don't go into the registry. So what we ended up happening when I asked through a Mexican FOIA request, which is a Freedom of Information Act in Mexico, access to información pública in the case of in Spanish, I requested back in the summer of 2019 the complete list from 2000 to 2019. Then again, an update in January 2021, and the latest update I request was September 2021. I have not received that batch. So the numbers I'm going to be presenting today contain 1,817 MOUs and letters of intent signed by Mexican authorities with US authorities from 2000 to December of 2020. Right. I also requested, as part of this FOIA request, a document that was requested by the President of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, in his last 6 months in office. He officially requested that all Mexican agencies created a document where they stated the key cooperation mechanisms that they had with the United States. The purpose of this document was to show President Trump that Mexico was cooperating with the United States in different areas that perhaps the President of the United States wasn't aware of. This document was never made public, and then the transition happened to President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, but I was able to obtain that document. I'm going to show you some of the findings. When you look at the US side, and you start looking at the database from the State Department, for the same period of time, we have 167 treaties or agreements signed with Mexico. So look at the difference. Mexico, 1,817. On the US side, 167. Out of those 167, 49 are considered executive agreements, MOUs, and letters of intent. And on both sides, we have 4 official traditional international treaties, signed by the executive, ratified by the Senate. So this really shows you the contrast how in 20 years, we have only signed 4 formal agreements, but we have these thousands and thousands of institutional agreements, interinstitutional cooperation deals signed by different bureaucracies and state authorities. Now, in terms of the numbers, when we look at the total of Mexico-US interinstitutional agreements, we can see that they actually they transcend different administrations, and they have actually been in the increase, except for the transition with President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that we had a decline in 2018 to 100, from 191 to 93, and then in 2020 to 51. But we can see basically that it didn't really matter who was in power. You see different transitions from Bush to Obama. We have a peak. We have a different transition between Calderon and Peña Nieto, and the agreements kept going. So this shows us that regardless of the changes of administration, at least for the past 20 years, previous 2018, bureaucrats and authorities kept signing these kind of agreements. It might be because they wanted to make sure that whatever they had signed stays in place, regardless of who's going to come into power, or whether they're the same bureaucrats or same members of the administration, just under a different presidency, but they want to keep continuing with that kind of cooperation. One of the things that might explain why the drop in 2018, as we know, is that under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the civil service was really affected with the transition to power. So a lot of government officials left their offices. There was a big shape in the administration. So that might show us that there was a drop because these are new people coming into play. So in total, again, that's 1,817. When we disaggregate the numbers and we try to figure out which agencies signed the agreements, we find that out of the total 1,817, roughly 267, that's 40%, involve only local authorities. So these are state authorities signing with other state authorities. It might be Arizona, the government of Arizona with the government of Sonora, or it might be a border town agreements. or also sister city agreements. We also include this in the database. 1,252, that's 69%, involved a mix of authorities. So this might be both either Mexican government officials with state authorities or vice versa, state authorities signed with federal authorities. There are interesting examples here also that involve Mexican consulates signing agreements with state authorities in the US side, let's say the government of the governor's office in Texas or the governor's office in California to help with certain procedures. And then 310 are actually just federal to federal. So these are federal authorities, federal departments, federal autonomous agencies signing it with federal US agencies directly. And that is 17%. So when it comes to consulates, again, there's a mix. As I said, there are some consulates that actually sign agreements directly with federal agencies, but also consulates that have signed agreements with state authorities. And this also raises interesting questions about federalism and the use of these kind of agreements to advance certain, I would say, quote unquote, bilateral foreign affairs policies that, as we know, on both sides of the border, technically they are unconstitutional because the foreign affairs powers always relies on the federal government. Then when it comes to the federal to federal, we see, again, federal agencies is the top line, the blue, the darker blue. Then we have also federal agencies Mexican federal agencies signing some agreements with US state and city authorities. And that is the lighter gray number. But again, you can see here, when you just disaggregate to the federal, this shows, again, the changes of administration. We have, when there are certain changes here, for example, there is a slope drop, but then immediately there's a spike. And then the same here, when there's a change of administration here. And then finally, this is the striking drop again, that might be explained by the revamp of the federal authorities on the Mexican side. And I want to be very careful here. Again, I only include all the way to December of 2020. We know that, for example, right now, the Mexican government has been signing agreements with the US under the umbrella of the high economic dialogue. And, you know, we had Secretary Blinken in Mexico a couple of days ago. So all of these agreements that have been signed since January 2021 to now are not contemplated in this database. But, you know, I am aware that this type of cooperation is still going on. Now, out of all the federal to federal, I disaggregated some examples of, for example, when it comes to, for example, security. There's 28% of those federal to federal agencies belong to security elements. And these are only the ones that have been disclosed. I am aware that some actually were classified, so they weren't actually disclosed, but it involves, you know, from a big number of interesting issues. It involves law enforcement at the border, terrorism financing and money laundering agreements between the federal and federal agencies, military cooperation and intelligence, and border cooperation among authorities. And then finally, going into the key collaboration mechanisms that I talked about that President Peña Nieto ordered the federal administration to create, we see here that out of all the documents that were mentioned in the key collaboration mechanism memo, a big number of them actually are institutional agreements. Again, these are MOUs and letters of intent. And if you think about it, if the president of Mexico wanted to have bargaining chips on the table to negotiate with President Trump, the interinstitutional agreements ended up being almost half of them. 43% are interinstitutional agreements and MOUs. So at least from the Mexican side point of view, these are very important collaboration mechanisms. And they're important for both sides of the border. At least we consider bargaining chips when it comes to negotiating with the US and renegotiating the relationship. Then we have other joint programs, binational groups, and bilateral commissions that I'm sure the ambassadors are going to talk about a little bit more about how those operate. Some of the interinstitutional agreements actually come from this type of meetings, the binational groups that gather together and meet on an annual and regular basis. Now, the last slide that I have for today is I disaggregated the numbers of agencies on the Mexican side that are that have signed more key collaboration mechanisms. Some interesting aspects there. We find that the Ministry of Agriculture, for example, is very active. The Ministry of Telecommunications and Transport is very active. So this means that they are signing all sorts of agreements, either to collaborate on radio frequencies at the border, to come up with joint phytosanitary policies to combat certain bugs or effects on agricultural products that are crossing the border. So they have strong collaboration mechanisms in place to address this kind of issues. What we don't have, and I want to be very clear here, and gathering a little bit of the conversation that Tony started, is we don't really know how effective these agreements are. We're just starting to understand, the architecture, how many are being signed, but we haven't been even able to actually analyze whether they are being implemented and the actual effects on public policy, because again, these have never been disclosed before, so we don't know the contents. The next stages of my project is to request individually each of the Mexican agencies to make public all the actual documents, so we can actually analyze the impact that they have had in public policy on particular sectors. So we can disaggregate it in the energy, for example, or trade or migration. But again, we don't know the effectiveness, and I think this is why it's so important, the conversation today, because I think the ambassadors can actually tell us more about this side of the story, as Tony mentioned, where the rubber hits the road, what actually happens with these agreements. With that, further ado, I'm just going to pass the microphone now to Ambassador Orlando to start the panel on his experience on how they live this, at least on the policy side of things.
Thank you, Guillermo, and thank you, Tony. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with everybody here today. I think this is an incredibly important topic that is really understudied. As Tony mentioned, the issue of these agreements really came alive during my tenure in Mexico, when in a number of different ways. Certainly the Cienfuegos detention and ultimate return to Mexico underscored the existence of these kind of agreements. I think it is critical, and I was saying this to Guillermo before, to have this kind of a database just so that there's some institutional memory. I think one thing that really comes out to me from what Guillermo just said is the really vast scope of these kinds of agreements. I mean, we use one word, agreement, which means many different things. And, some of them are very practical. I think if you can imagine, as he just said, there are agreements about agricultural inspections, let's say, to allow commerce between our countries to happen. I'm sure there are agreements about, what happens at the border in terms of the trucks waiting or the radio frequencies. That kind of architecture is very important. As you can imagine, that kind of nuts and bolts agreement isn't generally very controversial. I mean, going forward, people kind of get it may be controversial when it's being negotiated, but then it kind of takes care of itself. And there's a bureaucracy, I think, in each country that knows what the terms of that agreement are and follow the terms of that agreement. I thought I would just talk a little bit, take a step back, and focus on this issue of what is an agreement. Because I think at one end of the spectrum, we can all understand that, for instance, the kind of treaty that Tony mentioned, the water treaty. That is a formal written agreement that both countries formally signed in a ceremony. I'm sure they had the flags behind them. They probably exchanged their pens and said, okay, this imposes binding legal obligations on each side. United States has to deliver this much water to Mexico from the Colorado River Basin. Mexico has to deliver this much water to the United States from the Rio Grande River Basin. And, it's very clearly delineated. It's very formal. Somebody can complain. Everybody kind of knows what the obligations are. But I would say that kind of agreement, which is kind of the classical treaty, is very, very much the minority situation here. And frankly, I think much more common is an informal agreement. And even the word agreement, I think, is sometimes hard to nail down, particularly given that we're two border countries. So for instance, I'm thinking of the example when the pandemic started, the first week of the pandemic in March of 2020, there was the question what to do about our common border. And I remember, I got a call that Canada wanted to close its border with the United States to, tourism traffic. And so the United States had to kind of have a border policy. If we were going to do something with Canada, we kind of had to figure out what we were going to do with Mexico. So this is all happening, basically in one day. It was kind of crazy when the pandemic hit. So, this was something that, we were going to do. Every country had to kind of figure out what they were going to do almost in an emergency kind of situation. But obviously, nobody wants to create a problem at the border. So, I went down to the foreign ministry to talk about what we were going to do and, kind of discuss that with the Mexican side so that there wouldn't be confusion and chaos. And, the Mexican government articulated what they were going to do and how they responded to that. There was never an agreement in the sense of, a signed document where, I signed my name on behalf of the United States, but we kind of, each of us discussed what we were going to do under our own domestic laws in a way that would complement each other. So that agreement, I think, doesn't really qualify as an agreement in the sense that, the United States did not accept any binding obligations to Mexico or vice versa. But I think it is something that's pretty typical where, because of the need for coordination at the border, in a sense, there is something that you could call an agreement, just because each country has to understand, in a sense, acknowledge what the other is doing. And I don't know if that would fall within the scope of what Guillermo is looking at, because again, there was nothing signed. The problem with that kind of arrangement is that there really isn't much place for institutional memory of that thing. I mean, once I'm gone, I was the only person in the room, who kind of understood that from the American side, exactly what was agreed to. And, administrations change in Mexico and, and it wasn't an agreement in the sense the United States I did not commit my government to any obligations vis-a-vis Mexico, and same with Mexico to me. But I think that's pretty typical. I think that's frankly, a lot of what happened with the Remain in Mexico policy, that was a domestic interpretation of the United States' own asylum laws. And, we informed the Mexican government. We tried to coordinate the way that would work as a practical matter. I'll say on the Cienfuegos side of things, everybody knows what happened with the detention. And then, the Mexican government started to say, well, here are these agreements from, the 1990s. I think our law enforcement agencies, know what the rules were and believe they were operating within those rules. But this was not something I think that the political higher-ups are necessarily aware of, just because there isn't a central database saying these are the rules of the road for security cooperation between the United States and Mexico. And I think to the extent that this project can highlight what each side understands to be the rules of the road, that is very useful for both sides to just understand what their reciprocal obligations are. Again, both of our countries are I think marked by turnovers in governments and parties, and both of us have big bureaucracies. And when there is a specific bureaucracy that implements an agreement, I think they probably retain an institutional memory. But I think it's very important to have a mechanism for the political appointees to understand and appreciate this kind of structural framework of the relationship that's so important, because again, as Tony said, it's such a a broad and deep relationship that it kind of, unless there's a institutional mechanism, it kind of defies anybody getting on top of it. So I think with that, I probably will end my remarks and turn it over to my good friend and former colleague, Jerónimo Gutiérrez. Jerónimo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good morning to everybody. Let me start by thanking Tony Payan and Guillermo Garcia for the invitation to join you this morning. I also want to thank all of you for your interest and for taking the time to listening what we have to say. It's a pleasure to be at the Baker Institute and in particular at the Center for the United States and Mexico. This is not my first time that I've had the privilege to participate in something with the center, and it's always really, I'm always really glad to do it. And I have to repeat the compliment, and I have to say that it's really a pleasure to share the floor with my very good friend, Ambassador Chris Landau, and former colleague, and someone that I feel privileged of having the opportunity to meet a few years ago, and I hope that our friendship will continue. Let me also commend Guillermo's work at the outset. I think nobody has really done something like this before. There have been many people, many of us who had actually thought about, these types of agreements, and both from a practitioner point of view and also from the academic point of view, but nobody had really taking the time, in my view, to think about this seriously and begin to put the information out there for analysis, for debate, and for guiding the relationship. I think it's extremely useful what Guillermo and his team have done. I think it helps a lot to understand the relationship, and I do really commend you. I think that behind what Guillermo has done and where we're talking today is one basic notion, which is the idea that institutions matter in the bilateral relationship. They're not a panacea by any means, and to be sure, they're not a guarantee of good results by any means, but I think that they do matter. Basically, I think that over time, we, as the ties of the relationship have become broader and more complex and even more dynamic, we have relied in institutions to build a functional and a mutually beneficial relationship. What are institutions? I think there are basically four categories in the bilateral relationship. One is just, I think that, as Ambassador Landau was saying, is just systematic dialogue or mechanisms to have that dialogue. Number two, it's all sort of rules that we use to manage our interactions, whether it's a treaty, as with the one we just talked about on water, or it's a very simple and perhaps less ambitious memorandum of understanding. But those are basically about rules, about either explicit or implicit rules that help us govern our relationship. There are also programs like the Merida Initiative, which is now has been revamped or in the process of being revamped, which is a program. It's a binational program. And then finally, there is actually organizations like the International Water and Boundary Commission, the North American Development Banks, that have in itself a budget, personnel, a physical address, and they're an organization. And I think sort of that is the universe of what I would label bilateral institutions. And within that, the agreements are extremely important. And that is where the work of Guillermo really comes into play. So I very much like the question that was posed by Chris Landau about what are really, what's an agreement? And I'm not a lawyer. I don't have the benefit of being a lawyer as he is. And I think Guillermo, I'm not so sure, Tony, if you are, but I'm not a lawyer. But I think that in general, there are like three types. We can think of agreements in different ways. And one is just, I think it's even a verbal understanding that we are, each side is going to act in one way or another. And I think that even those are important because in my experience, a basic principle of the bilateral relationship that I think we should always keep in mind is what I call the no surprises principle. It's always good not to surprise. If you care about a foreign relation or between countries, you don't want to surprise your counterparts. I don't think so. I think it's much better to be clear about things. So you can think about agreements just simply at that type of verbal understanding. Then you can take it to the next level, which is basically what, these written agreements, whether it's a agreement, a memorandum of understanding, a set of procedures for something that do not require convening the respective parliaments or congresses and actually getting their approval there. Because I think that those type, the obligations of these types of agreements are in itself embedded in the statutes that either Mexico or the United States has and grant to the different agencies. So if we have an agreement to cooperate on water, well, let me not put the example on water, but on intelligence sharing or anything else, what we're doing is based upon the authority that the different agencies involved already have. They're agreeing something with their counterparts. They're coordinated. That means that each side is acting in itself, but within their own legal authority. And I think they're very useful. And I think that's really what was reflected in many ways in Guillermo's work. And they are a pulse of the relationship. They're sort of the whole, if you think about a car analogy, you have the motor and then you have all the systems, where these are the systems really in a way that help the relationship operate on a daily basis. And then you have obviously the big agreements like USMCA, our water agreement, actually, what we in general would label treaties with the respective differences on each side. Now, there are a couple of questions about these types of agreements that I have been asked over time based upon my experience. Are they meaningful? Are they important? Do they work? And my short answer is, and this is the notion behind the idea, the distinction between process and results. So people have come out to me and often said, well, but those agreements are just about process. They don't necessarily imply a result. And that might well be the case. But in my experience, it's much harder to get any result that is meaningful in the relationship if you don't have those agreements, right? They're not, in that sense, they're not a sufficient condition, but I think they might be might be a necessary condition. Now, people make the argument, but what about precedents? It's all about personal relationships in foreign affairs, and that's true. I think personal relationships and relationships between the presidents are extremely important, and they will never be substituted. But precisely these types of things give certain stability, institutional memory, as Chris was suggesting, and they provide stability to the relationship, and that is why they're meaningful. And I think that on balance, they help achieve results. Let me put an example also related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can certainly have a very good result in the relationship, even if there's no previous, we have never discussed about it and there's no specific agreement. And let's talk a little bit about COVID. When COVID came, well, we did not have a huge institutional framework to deal with this bilaterally. And I think that the way we deal with, it was very successful, especially at the beginning when we needed to, solve the most immediate things. Is the border open? Can we jointly define what are essential industries and the like? And I think that both sides, in a very difficult context, managed to do a very good job. I mean, there was certainly a very important disruption, but the relationship continued to move forward, again, by and large and in general. So I'm not saying it was perfect, but I think it would get fairly decent grades. So that was largely because of the leadership at that time, trying to solve things. And I give credit to the ones that were there, precisely addressing those issues. But the point is that if this happens again, we would really benefit from having some basic protocols that say, if this happens again, this is the way we're, this is sort of the item list we need to follow, or this is the sort of, essential industries that we need to make sure that are kept operating, or these, and that is solved largely through these types of mechanisms that we have talked about. And I think that's where they're useful. And I would certainly have benefit during my time to have such a comprehensive institutional memory. And the other thing is, this idea about putting all the information out there is important, because then there are all sorts of conspiracies about what we have agreed. And I think that's not useful. No? People often exaggerate. If they don't know about it, they talk about agreements like a secret agreement sometimes. And it's just very basic stuff, if I may use the term, just to solve the relationship on a daily basis. And to the extent that it's known public by everybody, I think it helps to contribute to demystify these sorts of agreements. So I just want to, institutions matter, and I think this is obviously a key element of the institution. Bilateral institutions, they're not, again, they allow us, they have allowed us to address things over over decades, such as our shared river basins along the border, to dealing with transnational organized crime, even to eradicating the screw worm, something that the young people might not remember, but it was hot on the 70s and 80s. And we actually had an agreement and an institution to deal with the screw worm, to nowadays something that it's a very hot topic, establishing, for example, resilient and efficient supply chain. So I think this is a great, a great exercise. And I hope that we can all support the people, academics like Tony and Guillermo, who are really on the forefront of studying the relationship and helping us understand better. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'll stop there to give as much time as possible to comments, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, both Ambassador Landau and Ambassador Gutierrez. Let me tell you, to begin with, to answer your question, I'm a political scientist, and so I often ask a different set of questions than lawyers or economists or sociologists would. And so, to me, I'm always very interested in issues of governance and such. By the way, I forgot to mention, we recently published this book titled Binational Commons, in institutional development and governance on the U.S. Mexico border. And I deliberately use the word binational commons, or the words, because I think that it is about the border. It is about the institutions that govern that space. And look, I hail from the region of Juarez El Paso, right? And so to me, the region has always been a commons in the political science, in the traditional sense of the commons. And so how is it that we govern the commons? And we've read that brilliant piece by Garrett Hardin, The Tragedy of the Commons, and what happens when a particular space, resource, territory, issue is not well governed as a commons. And so I think that what we're engaging today is really very, very important. And I think we ought to begin to think about issues as intermestic more than international, because we affect our lives on a daily basis. I want to invite the audience to submit their questions on the Q&A feature at the bottom center of your screen. You'll find a Q&A feature. You can, some questions have already come in. I will manage them for now. But I want to throw out there some of the key issues, beginning with a question for Guillermo. Very simple question. Where is the database? Where can it be consulted by the audience if they wanted to take a look at it?
Thank you, Tony. Brenda, so we're going to be publishing an article soon where some of the information, some of the presented information today is going to be available. But the actual database we're actually building with the Center for Binational Institutions of the U.S. Mexico Foundation. We're trying to build a database that can be accessible to anyone, where you can actually search institutions, the topics, the years, and actually, create your own your own research. So stay tuned on the announcements from the Center for Binational Institutions at the U.S. Mexico Foundation, because that's where it's going to be hosted. My intention is that this database, precisely for all the things discussed by the ambassadors, is that other people can benefit from it beyond whatever I'm writing about.
We'll be happy to link it on our website as well at the U.S. Mexico Center at Baker, so that people can also access that through various doors and entry points. I wanted to ask a question to Ambassador Landau and Ambassador Gutierrez that is a little bit more on the issue of, where to take the relationship in terms of the content and such. When I teach global systems or international relations, and my PhD is in political science, international relations at Georgetown, one of the things that I tell the students is that there are three words that can help us understand. It's a typology that can help us understand, how we govern a particular issue, and it has to do with goals and means. Coordinate simply means different goals and different means, and we just simply agree to stay out of each other's way. Think of traffic lights as one example. You may be on a bike, I may be on a car, we may have different destinations, but we just need a coordinating mechanism, green light, red light, so that we don't crash. Cooperate, which means I have some goals, you have some goals, but we need to operate together. Otherwise, you can obstruct my way, or I can obstruct your way, and then none of us can accomplish our goals, because cooperate means that we have to operate roughly jointly to achieve different goals. And collaborate, to me, involves defining goals together and working together. So there's layers, and I try to get the students to use the language in a kind of a fine way and use this typology. It means and goals, coordinate, cooperate, and collaborate in levels of hierarchy. Do you think that our two countries will ever reach a way of pooling their sovereignties, not renouncing to their sovereignties, but pooling their sovereignties, so that we can begin to define goals and means together, with the European Union as kind of an example of a more advanced way of understanding goals and means? Or are we always going to have this incredible panoply of mechanisms, some which coordinate, some which collaborate, force us to cooperate, and some in which we may collaborate, but ultimately always reacting as opposed to being proactive in the governance of binational issues? Ambassador Landau?
I would say that my biggest takeaway from my time as ambassador in Mexico was the power of the bureaucracies in both countries. And both countries have very big bureaucracies, which was very frustrating to me, because going to what you were just asking, Tony, I think there's a lot of areas in which the United States and Mexico have common ground. We both should want to defeat organized crime. We both should want to create a more rational system for labor to cross the border, and to make sure that the border is kind of a place that is regulated as opposed to a no man's land. And so I often think that there's so many win-win situations there where, again, we do have the same goals. Why is it that we have meeting after meeting after meeting in every administration? There's always been a high-level security meeting, like when we just had in Mexico City. And forgive me if I'm cynical, but when I was ambassador, I remember we had a high-level meeting on arms control, and I asked for the minutes of earlier high-level meetings. I got back 10 years worth of meetings where we were discussing the same issues, and nothing ever happened. And I think both countries should have a strong interest in making sure that powerful arms of the United States do not get into the hands of criminal gangs in Mexico. And why is it that this is not happening? And I think, having been in the room, my best answer is that there are entrenched bureaucracies on both sides of the border. You know, they have SAT in Mexico, you have ATF, DEA in the United States. Everybody has their own agenda. It is very, very difficult to move the bureaucracy. And I think that requires strong central leadership from the president in each country to really make those things happen. Because otherwise, I think we're just going to keep talking about these things forever. And so, you know, I mean, I agree with you, Tony, that we need to kind of try to identify those goals, but we've spent many, many years on procedure. And I agree with what Geronimo said. Procedure is important, but I don't think we're seeing the substantive results that we should be seeing from the procedure. And we wind up getting a lot of procedure without much to show for it. So, you know, I think we need to start demanding on both sides of the border that we actually see results, and as opposed to just high-level meetings.
Ambassador Gutierrez.
Sure, Tony. First, let me commend you on this typology. I think it's very helpful, and I think it's useful to think about many things that happen in relationships. Sort of, you know, when we communicate, we cooperate, and we collaborate. And I assume that collaborate is the one that is closest to actually, you know, dealing with sovereignty issues, because you actually get the chance to, you know, work on designing what are the goals rather than just, you know, having different goals and coordinating or communicating. So in terms of sovereignty, what I would say is that I think that you know, this is not the first time that Mexico, the relationship between Mexico, the United States, and sometimes with our North American partner, Canada, is viewed through the lens of what happened in the European Union. And to be honest, I sense that the history and the conditions of each case are completely different. And therefore, we have to be very careful, I think, in assuming that we're just in a transition to something more Europe-like in terms of what they did. And I think that what we have is actually quite functional, given the conditions. Now, having said that, I do believe that, I don't know whether I think that sovereignty would be very much linked to actually having sort of, you know, it's related to voting for representatives that are, you know, that would represent a jurisdiction that it's bigger than the United States and bigger than Mexico, right? And we don't have that yet. And I think that, you know, we're, in my view, very far from that. And I'm not even sure that that would be sort of the appropriate way to deal with, you know, our you know, partnership and geography. What I do think is that sometimes we misunderstood sovereignty, or at least, and I can speak on the Mexican side, that we we have a misconception of our sovereignty vis-a-vis the United States. And that I sometimes also think that Mexico feels the only way that, you know, it can deal with being sovereign is if we actually oppose the United States rather than work with the United States. And I think that's quite stupid and self-defeating. I think that in many instances, by and large, our interests align, and therefore you should work, as Chris was saying just now, in the case of dealing with organized crime and all of its facets, right? So I would love to see, for example, you know, let me give you an example. I think that it would be great in terms of dealing with, you know, organized crimes, that we do two things. That we actually produce a share assessment that it's public about what we see are the main shared security threats. We don't do that. I mean, we work together, thankfully, but I think it is extremely important. It goes a little bit to what you're saying, to collaborating, to actually having, you know, you will have the DEA issue a report, yeah, you know, every year, the National Drug Assessment, right? And it would say that cartels from Mexico are, you know, 80% of all the drugs that come to the United States, and a bunch of things about what is going on in Mexico. And then the Mexicans will go out and say, well, you have also the organizations on the US side that are selling in the streets. And we have not being able, I think, to put on a assessment together and say, this is what we see together is a problem. If we do that, which in a sense is, sharing some sort of sovereignty, if you'd like to put it that way, I think it'll be extremely useful. And it's not affecting, in my view anyway, Mexico or the United States. Related to that, I think that the United States has always seek, and rightly so, to have public security officials be in Mexico and work with Mexican security officials alongside on what we're doing. We should do the same on our side, but we don't. I would love to have Mexican security officials sit side by side with police officials from the DEA in Baltimore where they're selling drugs, or in Chicago where they're selling drugs. And I think those are the type of things that we should not be defensive through the sovereignty argument, right? That would be my answer. And I hope we move that way, because I think that would benefit both of the countries.
Thank you. Ambassador Landau, there's a provocative question here. The case of Cienfuegos, is that symbolic of the dysfunctionality of the relationship today? Could have been handled better? Does it mean something, or maybe it doesn't mean anything?
Look, I think that was a very unfortunate episode. I don't think it's fair to say that that is a uniquely driven by the prior administration in the United States, because in a sense that comes out of what I was talking about, the bureaucracy. I mean, I think we have these agreements for how U.S. and Mexican law enforcement agencies are supposed to cooperate. I think the institutional memory of those agreements lies primarily in the law enforcement agencies of the United States that work in Mexico. I think the problem is you had a assistant U.S. We have a very big government in the United States. You had a U.S. attorney's office in Brooklyn that decided to indict General Cienfuegos. That was not a political decision of the Trump administration. That was the career bureaucracy. And I think we need to do a better job in the United States of making sure that our bureaucracy has institutional checks to make sure that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. And, it was a very troubling episode. But again, I don't really think it's fair to say that was some kind of a political reflection on the Trump administration. I think no matter who's in charge of the United States, it's a big challenge to make sure that the entire United States government, far-flung as it is, and particularly when you're talking about these U.S. attorneys' offices that are very autonomous, that they understand what the limitations are. So I think there's a lot more we can do on the U.S. side there. Mm-hmm. But again, I don't really think it's fair to view that as uniquely tied to one particular administration.
Thank you. I'm going to give Guillermo a minute to comment on this thing that I talk to my students about, means and goals and means, and how different ways of calling them and working on that. But I will also put on the table a question from an ambassador to ambassadors, from Tony Wayne, of course, who's occupied your position, Ambassador Landau, at some point, and he says, can you give us an example of the challenges in managing the agencies themselves? And I think you just might have done that, but maybe another example, working out agreements without sufficient coordination and suggest best practices. So going beyond and seeing how to do that. So that's a question for both of you. I'm sure you can also read it there. So Memo, why don't you begin by making a comment, and then we'll go back to Ambassador Gutierrez and Ambassador Landau for their examples. And I'll tell you one thing. I just met with CBP personnel in Washington, D.C. over the last couple of days, and I can tell you that one of the things they're doing now is like, they told me back to basics, which means interpreting the new USMCA and what it means for companies. And one of the things that intrigued me was, one of them said, well, the companies come to us, CBP, and say, why can't we just fill out the NAFTA form, whatever the form was, A, B, C -1, 2, 3. It's like, well, because NAFTA doesn't exist anymore. Now we have a USMCA, and there's new provisions, and there's new forms, and there's new ways of doing it, and new fields within the form that you have to fill in, and things like that. And companies are often kind of confused because they can't figure out why they can't just file the old report or the old form and things like that. So I think the bureaucracies, like you mentioned, are ultimately charged with this and having to re-educate, for example, companies again when it comes to the new USMCA and what it means for them who are simply worried about getting their avocados into place or getting their factory parts down to Aguascalientes or the avocados down to Denver. That's all they care about. But the bureaucracy has to do its job. It has to grind the agreements. I'll get back to the examples that I just asked on behalf of Ambassador Tony Wayne memo, but you go first for a minute.
Actually, my comment is also connected to what Ambassador Wayne mentioned. But so going back a little bit back to your framework and your analogy with the European Union, I think from the legal point of view, which is, I'm a legal scholar, so this is what I what I like to do. What we are facing is that existing categories of, public international law, treaties signed under the traditional way, vis-a-vis these agreements, they don't really help us to understand the dynamic, right? So these are all definitions and all concepts that do not really fit, again, with the whole idea of the contemporary views of sovereignty. I think there's one common thing between the United States, Mexico relationship, probably also Canada, and with the European, and that is that what we're really facing right now is a global administrative law. We see agencies interacting, coming up with standards, best practices, looking at each other and trying to find ways to cooperate. So I think when you start looking at it from the administrative point of view, there might be best practices out there to implement these kind of agreements, to bring some transparency to them, to measure their effectiveness, but also, and here's the danger, to not politicize them. Because when you talk to some of these bureaucrats, what they don't want to do is they don't want to raise the issue up high, because once it reaches Congress, it becomes politicized, and then whatever it was working, it won't work anymore because they're going to, blow it up. So many of these agencies, they don't want to, make it more public what they are doing because they are afraid that this is going to become a political agenda. So you have to find a mechanism that doesn't fit with the traditional paradigms of public international law, and I don't like the term soft law because this is not actually soft law, because it's actually having effects in policy implementation.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Landau?
I think it is, obviously it's a big challenge with these big bureaucracies. I'll say, again, the bureaucracies are on both sides, and we had examples of, let's say, SAT coming up with new interpretations of their rules that created a real mess at the border, both for the Mexican side and for our side, or economia. I think it might have been economia now that I'm thinking about it. I think it's very important that there be more transparency in terms of, communications from one country to the other before you do something. In other words, even though it's your domestic law and you shouldn't have to inform the other side, I think it's very important to try to give a heads up that, hey, we're going to make this change in 60 days, and have some kind of a mechanism, for anything at least related to the border, that you have a chance to kind of at least explain it to people on your side, and make sure that there can be some kind of reciprocal agreement. I think each of us probably does things unilaterally on our side of the border that winds up affecting it. And sometimes it may just be a question of perception. I mean, sometimes I think Economia said, no, it's not really such a big change, but everybody was freaking out on the US side because they didn't really understand what it was. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining that. I think when we ultimately sat down with Economia and then we were able to explain it to our own bureaucracy and to our businesses, it worked out. So I think one of the examples of best practices I would encourage is to not spring rules on the other side kind of overnight, but try to give some heads up and allow a time for things to be explained so people don't freak out about something. I think a lot of times people, probably underestimate how a change is going to be received.
Ambassador Gutierrez?
Yes, there is nothing, if you want to accomplish big things in a, relationship like the one between the U.S. and Mexico, nothing will substitute for strong presidential leadership. That I'm convinced, and in that sense, I am fully on Chris' camp. Okay, what I do think is that in the absence of strong presidential leadership, we're better off with having basic rules to govern what we're doing on a daily basis, right? And the best possible scenario, I think, is one in which you actually have very strong and committed presidential leadership, and you do have a bureaucracy with all that we're talking about, that it's working efficiently and perfectly aligned, not because of process, but because high-level goals have been set at the highest level, and there is accountability of the bureaucracy to the presidential leadership, which, everywhere around the world, is really heads of state that conduct, are the ultimate responsible of foreign affairs. I think that's the best scenario. And I think that when important things are accomplished is precisely because you have the combination of very strong high-level presidential leadership, and you also have been able, and I think, that's the case of USMCA, which is in a sense, a key institution, right? And I think many of the things that have been established throughout, history that have really worked and made a big difference in the relationship have probably had those two elements, okay? Now, Ambassador Wayne was asking, how do you deal with this? Sort of, how do you solve there? I don't think there's a recipe, and he knows well, actually. I think he was ambassador more time than Chris and myself, right? But I do think that if, one possibility that's worth considering is in 1981, Presidents Reagan and Lopez Portillo established the Binational Commission. And it was a forum to provide, actually, its objective was precisely to provide high-level attention to the relationship, okay? The BNC serve, and that is what I think these things might be helpful, they serve as action-creating events, in a way, okay? Where cabinets meet and very clearly receive the guidance and specific instructions of the president. And if they meet regularly, then you have all of the cabinet members and the ambassadors, working very diligently, because they're going to, a year or 6 months from now, they're going to get called in by the president and say, what happened with XYZ? Or, I know that businesses are being affected by X or Y factors. And I think that's extremely useful, right? The BNC became, in a sense, a victim of its own success, or the success of the relationship, because the relationship became very decentralized, with agencies on both sides gradually establishing very strong individual ties between one another, and it stopped meeting. I don't know whether that is the actual, a good way to deal with sort of, to bring together presidential leadership with institutional sort of framework. I'm not sure if that's, the best alternative today, but it's something that I think it's certainly worth considering.
We have only a few minutes, so I want to squeeze as many questions as possible. So I'll just summarize a couple of the questions that I think are important here. One is, it has to do with global warming. I mean, obviously, the relationship is about to be overwhelmed by much greater issues than we even think. Climate change may be one of them. There's less and less water. We see the crisis at the Colorado River, for example. There's just simply no water. In the Western United States is getting more difficult. In Northern Mexico is getting more difficult. So are the agreements in place just barely sufficient, or are they just about to go by the wayside and we're about to engage in these bigger issues? So what should we be anticipating in terms of the larger issues that are about to come into play in the relationship? And the other thing is a question, a really interesting question about central borderlands in El Paso, which I'm very familiar with. It has to do with local devolution of sovereignty, or the ability to agree on specific issues and to allow a greater voice to local governments and state governments. It seems to me that a lot of these agreements show that it's centralized in the federal government. It's centralized in agencies, in bureaucracies at the federal level, at the high level economic dialogue in between Mexico City and Washington. And when I have participated, because I did participate in some of the local conversations in El Paso and Juarez, for example, the most you could do is some sort of memorandum of intention, sort of an expression of goodwill, a sort of something that ultimately is not binding. It's not vinculante, as they call it in Mexico. It's not binding. So it's is it time to allow these local governments to have a greater, more binding voice in what they need? Let's start with Ambassador Christopher Landau. Those two issues, big issues and the local issues.
Going to the local issues, I actually think that's a very interesting idea. I mean, I think it's the strength of the U.S. Mexico relationship that it is somewhat decentralized, because it's just a fact of life that we're going to have turnover in Washington and Mexico City, and the relationship needs that continuity. And I think there's so many different people affected by the relationship. I think one of the challenges is, how do you let the people on the border who are the most affected by the relationship in many ways have a bigger say in it? So I would be very open to thinking of ways to get people on the border involved in the relationship. And obviously we're in a federal system, as is Mexico, and ultimately a lot of these powers are in the central government. But I think there's a lot of vitality of the relationship that is added by these kinds of actors.
Ambassador Gutierrez, both the very large unforeseen things like climate change and what it means, and then of course the local, because I was very, very, very familiar with it when I was in El Paso. I served in the Regional Mobility Authority in El Paso, and I served in the Plan Estratégico de Juárez, and I also served in the Cross-Border Relations Committee, and it was very frustrating. We practically had no power, more than advisory, so to speak, and nobody ever paid attention to this.
What, half jokingly, but what people at the border say, as you know, I spend a good amount of time dealing with bilateral issues at the border for different reasons. And what most people at the border say, half jokingly, is that if we get Washington and Mexico City put aside, they'll solve everything, right? And I think there's some truth to that. Nobody knows the border as well as border communities and border authorities in general. Now, I obviously it's impossible to abstract completely from federal governments and federal authorities, the big issues. They have a good reason for existing. But in terms of dealing with the local and dealing especially in the local context with border issues, I do think that local authorities, local civil society, businesses have a very strong role to play, and that federal government authorities should be, as much as possible, serve as a catalyst. When I was ambassador, and I actually told this my successor, I said, listen, you have to, in my view, you have to understand yourself as a facilitator of things, not a controller, because if not, reality is just going to run you over, because there is so much going on in the relationship and so many players, many of them local, that it's best for you just to facilitate. And I think that's important. So I think that I hope to see, that in the future, I'm pretty sure we will see a bigger role of the local. And there are some very immediate opportunities. And again, I'm not sure whether that's the right approach, but the Border Governors Conference has not met in full since, I think, 2009, to put an example.
2010, yeah.
Yeah, and therefore, and I think it was a very useful forum. So I hope that we do see more of that, and these sort of multi-dimension diplomacy. And I think that it's very proper of the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. And I think it does, on balance, it serves the overall relationship. On the big issues, I think that climate change is one of the things that I regret, where we're just simply not seeing eyeball to eyeball. I think that Mexico's energy policy is and I have to say it is absolutely backward looking in that regard, the energy policy that is being proposed by the present administration. I say this with respect and trying to be objective of what I say, but I think that, you know, it's very clear that we're pointing in a model that I think 99.9% of the country sees that has been surpassed by time. And at the same time, we don't have, you know, everything points to the fact that we should be treating climate change much more seriously than we have. And I think that's one of the areas where there might not be a outright and clear open confrontation, but I think we're just missing a huge opportunity to work together, and missing in that regard a huge world topic where Mexico and the United States could jointly play a role. And they're simply, as things look now, they're simply not going to be doing that.
Thank you. Memo, I'm going to give you 1 minute and then Ambassador Landau to close, because I think we just passed the hour and 15 minutes. And I promised you I wouldn't keep you more than an hour and 15 minutes. So Memo and then Ambassador Landau to close, and then we'll say goodbye. Memo.
So very quickly on the big issue, the environmental aspect, I think the USMCA renegotiation, the renegotiation of NAFTA that led to the USMCA was a missed opportunity to include that, especially in Chapter 24. There's the one that deals with environmental law has nothing to. There's no even a mentioning of climate change. There's no even a mentioning of carbon emissions. So it's only about environmental standards and some treaties that both countries have signed. So, and there's the hope. I almost want to leave you with a little bit of hope. If the US and Mexico decides to include the climate Paris Agreement within those multilateral agreements, then all the enforcement mechanisms attached to Chapter 24, that includes, for example, bringing claims, individual claims, like people in Mexico can bring actually a procedure against Mexico because Mexico decided not to implement its environmental standards or treaties for a unfair market practice. Then you can have some sort of movement, at least in Mexico, that is going to, enter into some conflict with the current energy policies. But there might be some hope there. But I think definitely I agree with what was said by Ambassador Gutierrez. There was a missed opportunity to attend those issues on the USMCA, and now the current energy policy is not particularly going to help us. Thank you,
Ambassador Landau. You have the last word.
Well, thank you. That's a big burden, I guess. I just want to say that. We talk a lot about the challenges here. I think one of the things I just want to underscore is that in many ways, I think we have to acknowledge some of the progress that we've made. I mean, when I was a student back in the 80s studying the U.S. Mexico relationship, there was a lot more separation between our countries. I think we've come a long way in the last 30, 40 years in terms of engaging with each other. I think NAFTA, USMCA has really changed the playing field. I don't think it's probably realistic to look to Europe as a model, as was said before. I think our countries, our histories are, put us on a different track. But I think we need to figure out how is it that something as far-reaching as USMCA and before that NAFTA passed? How did we manage to solve that problem? And how do we take whatever worked there and make it work in the very challenging security situation that we have, and I would say the very challenging migration challenge that we have too, particularly now that we're seeing migration coming from all over the world. The migration problem itself has changed a lot over time. So I guess I would try to, end by focusing on the glass being half full, that I think NAFTA and the USMCA shows that it can be done between the United States and Mexico. And I think we should just, encourage agreements on every level, but try to get some big agreements on these major challenges at the foundation of the relationship. And thank you for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Ambassador Landau. Thank you, Ambassador Gutierrez, and thank you, Memo, and congratulations on this great project. I think it's the beginning of a number of important hypotheses that we'll be addressing in a series of conversations in the future. And I want to thank our audience for sticking with us for an hour and 20 minutes. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully you'll join us in our next events here at the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute in Houston, Texas. Thank you.